Well, thank you very much, George, for the invitation to moderate this panel. And I'd like to congratulate you on your visionary leadership in terms of getting the Davos Alzheimer Collaborative off the ground. Very, very exciting in terms of what it will offer. And we hope that the regulatory aspects also will feed very much into the advancement of this collaborative over the next 5 years and beyond. It's my great pleasure to moderate the panel today. It's evening in Singapore, but good morning or good afternoon to you in other parts of the world. And I'd like to say as introductory comments that over the past 2 years, the Lausanne workshop has focused on two main regulatory themes. The first one is the importance of building infrastructure that enables global regulatory alignment and also information sharing for Alzheimer's disease. The second theme is why and how regulatory agencies must evolve to account for advances in the science that are enabling interventions earlier in the disease for both detection tools as well as for therapeutics. And you heard quite a bit about this yesterday. So today we're going to speak in more detail about both of these themes, but acknowledging that we also find ourselves at a very, very interesting time in the regulatory journey for AD. So, of course, many of you would know that in the US, aducanumab, which is a human monoclonal antibody targeting beta amyloid, will be reviewed by the FDA by March. It's gone through some issues, but this is the target that we understand the FDA has set for this particular product. And in fact, the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, has already accepted aducanumab for review. Interestingly, in China, the NMPA, or the National Medical Products Administration, has already approved a new treatment for mild to moderate AD and improving cognitive function. And of course, we heard yesterday about other innovations that are emerging in the detection, diagnosis, and therapeutics pipeline. One key significant issue of the regulatory landscape is global collaboration. And my panelists will be telling us more about this from their various perspectives in Japan, Europe, and the US very shortly. But in fact, there's a certain history to this. And in fact, it's a great delight to be on the panel with Andy Varneshenbach, because way back in 2006, when the FDA celebrated its centenary, he organized a summit, which I was privileged to be at, of key regulatory agencies. And this developed into an annual summit where heads of agencies came together to talk about issues. And this really set the stage for what has now become ICMRA, the International Coalition for Medicines Regulatory Authorities, that is playing a very significant role, certainly in the COVID pandemic, and I believe also will be very important for the future of AD regulatory approvals going forward. And of course, other forms of collaboration have been going on to promote really the concept of convergence and reliance. And the World Health Organization significantly promotes this so that there's a lot more sharing and discussion going on at an early stage, rather than every regulatory agency necessarily starting from scratch. Certainly, the FDA and the EMA have been working very closely over the years, but in other parts of the world, and even from Singapore, where I am, we're part of a smaller coalition with Australia, Canada, Switzerland, and now the UK that has come into this equation, where there is exchange of information and work sharing initiatives going on. And there are many regional initiatives. And for AD, I think this is extremely important, because as new products come on board, it is important that regulators are talking to each other early. So let's come back to this in the panel as we hear more about what is going on. But first, I would like to let my panelists introduce themselves very briefly, rather than my go through the introductions. And so could I invite Klaus Bolte to tell us a little bit about yourself in 30 seconds. Klaus.
Hi, John. Thank you very much indeed. Honor and pleasure to be here. I'm heading the marketing authorization sector here at Swissmedic, Switzerland, in Bern, not too far from Lausanne, and in fact also not too far from Davos. So that's comprising in my sector preclinical, clinical, quality, regulatory, case management, and some support functions across all therapy areas. And that's, I guess, what I'll bring to bear, a cross-therapeutic view and perspective, as well as having been one of the earlier members of the Lausanne Dialogues, which started a number of years ago in Lausanne and in fact in Geneva as well, at the League of Nations building. I remember this very fondly, and I hope we can even increase the momentum now moving forward. Thanks.
Wonderful, Klaus. It's wonderful that you're physically there, whereas I'm virtually there with this background of Lausanne, where
I can tell,
I'm actually sitting in Singapore. Andy Varneshenbach, please tell us a bit more about yourself.
Thank you, John. And it's a privilege to be a part of this panel, but even more importantly, to really witness the tremendous progress that's been accomplished by this effort. As you pointed out, I'm a recovering federal employee as former commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration and director of the National Cancer Institute. I currently am the president of Samaritan Health Initiatives, which is an effort to continuously accelerate the discovery, development, and delivery of these innovative opportunities that are emerging from the amazing progress in science and technology. And in addition to advising on policy, I also, in full disclosure, participate as an advisor and sitting on the boards of some companies that are engaged in this effort.
Thanks very much, Andy. Ken Sakushima, could you please tell us a bit about yourself? Ken.
Thank you very much, John. It's my great honor to be here and participating in this panel. I'm a principal reviewer in clinical medicine in PMDA, Japanese regulatory agency. I'm engaged in the review of drugs for neurological diseases based on my specialty, neurology and internal medicine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. And Maria Tome, please tell us about yourself. You need to unmute, Maria. No, yes.
I am Maria
Hello,
Tome. I work at the European Medicine Agency as a senior scientific officer. And as Klaus, we review all of the developments and they come in to the agency. Usually we meet once a month. And this is a committee that is part of, we have 100 members. And I need to mention that because the European Medicine Agency is a network agency of 30 countries. And like I say, we review all of the therapeutic areas. I usually work in TNS, but last year, for example, was a lot about infectious diseases, as you can imagine, and as you mentioned. And it's a privilege to be here. I've been in Lausanne several years already. And thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Maria. So as you can see, we have a wonderful panel with a great deal of experience that hopefully will give the audience a much better understanding of the regulatory issues as we think of therapeutics and diagnostics for Alzheimer's. For the first part of the discussion, we'd like to dwell a bit on where are we headed from a regulatory perspective in terms of AD. What are the biggest challenges? What should we be thinking about and asking ourselves as new therapeutics and diagnostics enter the pipeline? And I'd like to pose the question first to Andy. Could you tell us a bit about what a regulatory agency would look for as it considers approval of a new product? How can we create both comfort and confidence for a regulator so that developers and companies can get the decision and outcome that, in fact, not only the companies but the patients want to move therapies forward? And certainly from your own experience and perspective, are there any particular learnings from oncology? So a whole slew of questions, Andy, but I think you're in a very good position to answer them. So could we have your thoughts on this?
Thank you, John. I think you framed it perfectly by recognizing that for regulatory agencies to make a decision, they need to be both confident and comfortable with that decision. The confidence emanates from the data itself. And without the data and without it being scientifically sound and subject to all the appropriate scrutiny, you do not have the basis for a decision. But you have to go beyond the confidence in the data to really comfort with the entire process. And that, I think, involves the agency being engaged in the total life cycle of these products. And so regulators who can engage very early on with the sponsor in the discovery end of the continuum so that you have insights into the preclinical data that's been generated, understanding how, in fact, this particular compound is expected to work, once being applied in the human condition. It goes then into being engaged with the actual clinical assessment of the product and participating even in the design of the clinical trials and the expectations with regard to the endpoints and outputs and outcomes. But it doesn't even end there. It continues on, I believe, even after the process of approval, in which I think regulatory agencies stay engaged in post-market and post-market surveillance. So we have the opportunity to understand the performance of these products in large populations that are far more diverse than we would ever accomplish in the context of a prospective randomized trial. And so that comfort level comes from being engaged in total life cycle, where there's an in-depth understanding and trust. And not only does the data support that the compound is safe and effective, but we understand the how and the why it may be achieving the appropriate outcome in the patients that it's being applied to. With confidence in the data and confidence in the process, then I think we accelerate regulatory approvals. The lesson I think that oncology has taught us and that regulators need to keep in mind is that when we approve a drug, we're really approving a reagent that then participates in what is essentially a human experiment to understand the disease itself by the way in which that reagent is impacting and affecting the biology of the disease. And so with that in mind, it's often the case that progress will be incremental. First in class is generally not always the best in class. And so as we learned in oncology, an approval of a drug may not be the approval of the final solution. It may be the approval of the first step in an ongoing experiment upon which we can continuously improve. We can continuously discover newer or better modifications of that drug, or even more importantly, discover the integration and interoperable combination of that drug with other interventions, the sum of which gives us a solution to the problem, whether it's cancer or Alzheimer's.
Thanks very much, Andy. I think that's nothing less than we would have expected from a former FDA commissioner. It's a beautiful and very elegant summary of the issues that regulators face. In fact, one of the best I've heard. Thank you very much for that very clear explanation. Can we move to Ken? Can you tell us from your perspective in Japan, what developments have you seen in terms of PMDA, the Pharmaceutical and Medical Devices Agency, that may be relevant for the future of AD drug approval? And I think you have certain documents of issues to consider in drug development, which you would like to share with us, and we'd be very interested to hear this. So could you tell us about the situation in Japan, Ken?
Thank you for the question. So I would like to introduce two guidance-like documents in Japan. So the first one is a document titled Issues to Consider in the Clinical Evaluation and Development of Drugs for Alzheimer's Disease. The second one is the document titled Issues to Consider in the Non-Clinical Evaluation of Drug Discovery for Alzheimer's Disease and Clinical Practice based on Pharmacoepidemiology. So these two guidance documents are very important because these documents provide what you need to know for AD drug development in Japan. And this will contribute future drug development, both in clinical development and non-clinical development. This is my answer.
Thank you very much. And we'll come back to you later to see other perspectives from the Japanese point of view. Maria, tell us a bit more about the latest in EMA thinking as it relates to the qualification of new products. And I believe there are several IMI projects, Horizon 2020 and the Accelerating Medicines Partnership in the US between NIH and FDA. Can you share some thoughts on this in relation to AD products?
Thank you very much. Part of our job also in the agency is to work with these collaborations. We learn science all the time. And one of the characteristics is that as part of the IMI, we've been very lucky to get involved in evaluation of several of these projects, and they've been submitting to us and creating biomarkers. And the biomarkers that we have very lucky to be able to include new learnings, for example, in brain development, thanks to the Autism project and platform. We have also another platform that work in developing biochemistry, biomarkers for Alzheimer, and that you have a lot of information of the different biomarkers coming, and I will advise people to give a look. And then, of course, we work also very close with the American colleagues, and that is the Accelerating Partnership, which again, we collaborate with FDA and we sit in the committees, and we evaluate any biomarkers that they are coming, we're trying to integrate in our knowledge and development of the new products. Then the position is that, and if we learn something new that can help the development of the product, we will try to put in contact these people and tell them what we understand from this biomarker. And a good example was when we started in Alzheimer, and we have adacanumab as an example. Nobody was believed that we can develop the product based in a biomarker. And in reality, they have used biomarkers developed by these platforms, like the PET, to enroll the patients. And they have used these biomarkers also for see the efficacy of the product. And with that, I leave it to you. But I recommend people to understand that we work together, and any information that is coming and people share with us, we try to incorporate in our guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Klaus, can you share a bit from the Swissmedic perspective and any other thoughts as well in terms of this particular area, the kind of issues and challenges being faced by regulators for AD products?
Yes, thanks, John. I can only echo what Andrew and Maria already stated. I'd like to add perhaps that there needs to be more of an emphasis on an early dialogue. When you accompany a research group or a research-based company, startup or spin-off, especially the smaller ones, you can detect quite early where they are at in their development. And if they are not only on the right track in terms of taking necessary regulatory hurdles, but also if they are on the right track of developing a compound appropriately. So early dialogue is very important to avoid failures, or if you fail, then you should fail early in order not to waste any resources. Early dialogue would be number one. Number two is we should focus perhaps as regulators a little bit more on establishing the diagnosis earlier, but also more sensitively. Just a couple of days ago, I guess most of you have read the Nature Aging article. There was a fantastic example given of how several biomarkers, several tools combined and analyzed also with the help of artificial intelligence, or an algorithm at least, could help to differentiate between age-related cognitive decline and real Alzheimer dementia, differentiating between the two, and also extrapolating this with a fairly high prognostic value. So my second point would be, as a regulator, let's focus more on establishing the diagnosis earlier, and also validating those methodologies in combination, in collaboration with companies that develop those tools, smart apps, artificial intelligence apps, and tools the like. And number three, you mentioned it yourself, John, already. I guess it's very clear, and George in his intro also alluded to it, that also COVID-19 showed that we need even more of an exchange. We need more international collaboration and an exchange in terms of also early dialogue aspects, diagnostic aspects, how we can enable remote monitoring before we even come to assessing the first clinical results. So greater international or regional collaboration like an access would be my third point I'd like to add.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Very, very clear. I think this issue of early dialogue is extremely important, and basically all stringent regulatory authorities, as far as I know, around the world, offer that option. And I think this is something very critical, as you've highlighted, rather than sort of let things move on to a point where early issues were not addressed up front. And I think this is something that we need to bear in mind, even when we're thinking of AD products. And I think Andy's point, as he drew from oncology, on this incremental, stepwise perspective is also very important. But one point you raised, Klaus, and there's a question that has come through the chat, which I think is linked to the commercial implications of regulatory decisions. I'll read out the question and then perhaps pose it to Andy first. It says, yesterday, Sarepta was mentioned as an example of where a drug was approved, and this stimulated additional investment in research related to that disease. And so the question is, are we facing the same situation here potentially with aducanumab? Would its approval likely spur additional investment? Andy, what are your thoughts on this? Sorry, could you unmute, Andy?
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I think it goes back to the issue of comfort and incrementalism that we learn from the experience. And once a product is available to be used in the widespread medical community, we begin to understand nuances with regard to that utilization. Different populations, for example, that may have a greater or lesser degree of response. Finding where there may be adjunctive kind of interventions that enhance or improve. So it does open the door, John. And once the door is open and there's the opportunity for that incremental growth in both knowledge and clinical improvement, then I think that brings a larger focus and a larger population of effort. So the simple answer is yes, an approval will in fact open and stimulate greater progress, but it's not simply a commercial opportunity. It's a scientific opportunity. It's a clinical opportunity. At the core and the heart of all of this, there are desperate patients for whom there is relatively nothing else available. And so when we were in oncology and we had a drug that produced a 30% response rate, that clearly was not the solution to cancer, but it was the critical first step in going to another drug that got us to 60%. And finally, in testicular cancer, when we had 3 drugs together, we virtually were able to cure patients with widespread metastatic disease. I think that same model will apply here in Alzheimer's disease. And the first approval will start that journey.
Thank you very much. Maria, do you have any further thoughts on this particular issue?
I fully agree with Andrew. Then, as soon we have a drug, and it can be the FDA, the first one, it will look the timetable. That creates a stimulus, and I think a confidence to the regulators to help and have a kind of the standards, a baremo that we have decided what we see is good enough. And I think that usually gives companies confidence, not only companies, but also patients. Remember that we are developing for the public, and the public wants to see a drug that works, and they want to understand how we work and what is the consequence and the safety of the drug. And I fully agree with Andy what he has said. And we really hope to have it next year, basically, to have the discussion next year, what to do next. Thank you.
Thank you.
John,
yes, please, Andy. Yeah, please.
You know, this is an important discussion, and I think I'd love to hear the other panelists' perspective. But I think for listeners, it's important also to point out that once a regulator approves a drug, it doesn't mean from that point on we're totally, completely blindfolded or oblivious to what is subsequently happening. So the ability for the agencies to stay engaged in post-market, to continue to have the tools for surveillance and understanding the performance of these products in the real world and under different circumstances, and then continuously adjust and modify the regulatory decision as that data becomes more available and appropriate for decision making. So it's important for, I think, the public who are scrutinizing our decisions to understand that we have the opportunity and tools today to make regulatory approvals a continuous learning process and a continuous improvement process. And we can modify and change and alter labeling and regulatory decisions as we learn more and do more, and for the benefit of patients.
Thanks, Andy. That's a particularly important point, and Klaus will come in a minute. But I just wanted to emphasize, I think this aspect is important for the audience to know that, in fact, regulation is able, and as we see this even with COVID products coming out, to move from the pre-market decision-making, but to have more of the post-market real-world evidence, real-world data collection is an extremely significant aspect of regulation these days. And so we're looking at the whole life cycle of a drug rather than just the point of approval, and it has moved on from a single point to actually multiple points. Klaus, over to you.
Yeah, if I may hop in, the question you posed, or that came into our chat room, brought two very important aspects up that are intertwined. The first aspect is financial incentive. Yes, indeed, it's always helpful to have this financial incentive. It's a very strong incentive typically, but not with this old primary care blockbuster model in mind, please. I think some of those drug developers, larger research-based drug companies, still have this outdated blockbuster model in mind, ideally reaching out or capturing all Alzheimer or dementia patients even. This is not on anymore, and you have to adjust your financial forecast and your incentive accordingly. And number two, which is tied to this financial aspect, and Andy already mentioned it based on our oncology experience, you have to start small. In oncology, we increasingly see genetically defined tiny subgroups, which we approve a drug for in the first place. Tiny subgroups. They have orphan drug designations quite frequently. And that is your foot in the door, as Andy mentioned it. That is your foot in the door. You can expand from then on with real-world data, real-world evidence even, but you have to make a start. And a smaller start with a well-defined, not necessarily in our case genetically defined subpopulation, a small subpopulation based on AI, machine learning, and some intelligent, smart tools, a tiny subpopulation, an approval for this subgroup would help all of us, in particular, all those patients tremendously. So we have to have this shift implemented also in our drug development from a big, major primary care market blockbuster financial incentive concept to tiny oncology-like genetically modified or defined subgroups. This is a shift I have not seen occurring, quite frankly, in all the talks we had when we gave scientific advice or pre-submission meetings.
But that is a very important point, Klaus. And I think both developers as well as patients need to understand this, that the whole science of regulation has been changing quite significantly. Certainly, Andy, from the point we met in 2006 in Washington, D.C. to now, the whole regulatory landscape has changed significantly in terms of adaptive trials, rolling submissions. And so I think this is very important to understand that the nature of regulation actually embraces innovation a lot more than people might realize. But Ken, I would like to come back to you to understand more about the situation in Japan, because research into neurodegenerative disorders and therapies is moving very significantly in Japan. And of course, Japan is a major member of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative as well. Could you tell us a bit more about the whole landscape in terms of R&D there for degenerative products and how PMDA is responding to this? Because I believe new processes have been put in place to approve cellular therapies, for example. Ken, over to you.
Thank you for the question. Let me answer your question with starting the category of medicinal product in Japan. So we have pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and regenerative product. So that regenerative product has a special scheme for early approval. So it is a great way to enhance the regenerative product development. So on the other hand, so pharmaceutical is another category, so including Alzheimer drugs. It also has another scheme called Sakigake. It is enhanced drug development so much. So that there are some schemes, so initiatives related and enhance drug and medicinal product and regenerative product in Japan. So you can see the details in the PMDA website and MHLW website. It is Health Ministry of Japan. This is my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. And to the audience, I would recommend that you look at the PMDA and Japanese situation a bit more, because I was there in Tokyo when Sakigake was launched several years ago, and it has actually changed the whole perspective of the PMDA, both in terms of how people perceive PMDA and how they've actually moved on very fast in terms of approvals. I'd like now to shift the conversation back, and George mentioned, in fact, this whole conference has highlighted the point that we cannot ignore the impact of COVID-19. And so I'd like to spend some minutes to ask you your perspectives on the implications of COVID-19 for AD and therapies. And maybe, Klaus, could you begin first by telling us about Swissmedic's response to this? What have you learned, certainly in the last 9 to 10 months? And what have you seen, do you think, that we can apply to AD, particularly as it relates to what you already mentioned in terms of artificial intelligence and digital solutions and diagnosis? Klaus?
Yes, thanks, John. Well, looking back at our early Lausanne days, I remember two things. Number one, and that helped us a lot. There was, and there is today as well, within the COVID-19 pandemic, there is global acknowledgement that indeed we have a health crisis, a WHO-led, if you like, global acknowledgement that indeed we all have to to deal with this crisis, this pandemic, COVID-19. And we had something very similar earlier in our Lausanne dialogues and the context we were operating in. And number two, there was also political recognition that this indeed has an impact on national economies. I remember that at the time, David Cameron, he was head of the G7 or G8 at the time, including Russia, group of nations, and he was far-sighted. It was very clear to him, and he put a lot of weight into this G7, G8, and later OECD initiative. He lent us a lot of weight by recognizing politically that indeed there is an impact, an economic, a long-term impact that we all have to bear. And these two components come together now as well in this COVID-19 pandemic. There's this acknowledgement, a global or international one, and also political effort. And there are some great public-private partnerships as well. When you look at some of these vaccine candidates, I don't want to mention any names, but I guess we know all who they are. And some of them were stemming from some fantastic public-private partnerships, later on developed, of course, by large research-based companies who have indeed the infrastructure and the scale-up capabilities you need as well in order to make vaccines available very soon, almost in parallel. So these two components, I guess, are commonalities from what I remember from our early Lausanne days. And this helped us a lot also right now in this COVID-19 pandemic. We clearly need our political leaders to understand the impact of any burden of disease, if it's Alzheimer's, if it's COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, or any other disease in our societies. And it is up to us, to some extent, regulators. We regulators are closer somehow to our political leaders, even though strictly independent, of course, to educate them on the impact that any disease, a pandemic, or the horrible Alzheimer dementia endemic situation will have on their economies. And there's the financial incentive, again, from the other side. If politicians understand this type of financial or economic impact, then you may be surprised what sort of resources and enabling technologies they can help you to fund. There are two communalities. I want to stop right there and render it more interactive, if you agree, John. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Klaus, as always. Can I ask Maria first and then Ken, share perspectives on the impact of COVID-19 from the European Medicine Agency's perspective and the PMDA perspective, and what lessons can be learned potentially for AD therapies? Maria first. You need to unmute, Maria.
I think thank you first to the regulators, the colleagues, because of course, we have at the EMA an FDA office and a PMDA office. Just to clarify, then regulators, we work very closely because even in the buildings, we share office to share information. And I think in one way, COVID-19 has given us the capability to see that we are very free to share information. It was really a commitment, and I agree with Klaus, from the top, from the governments, that we are free to share information. Because a lot of times privacy laws really limit a lot, and confidential information from companies, commercial information. It creates a lot of issues between us, even in the same building, to share documents. Okay, and Klaus also is inviting a lot of times, and Swissmedic and Health Canada has taken part in these kind of meetings. We share information, and I think, and I agree with Klaus, that we can have support from the top, from the governments, and to be sure, and from companies. Companies that have been very open also to share commercial information. They put very quick their own protocols in the websites. And people was learning each other of what they were doing. Then I think that is needed for Alzheimer. And indeed, you give me the idea for my last position in the panel. That is what they really needed. More transparency in commercial information, more transparency for us, even regulators, to talk between agencies. We are, and we usually are, and we talk. But reality is that more and more companies and laws from the top, it limits us to share information. We do it every day, but that really has helped us. Thank you so much. And you can see it in this panel also, that you have people all over the world in 3 time zones. Within the past, it was more unusual to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Ken, the lessons for PMDA from COVID-19 in relation to AD therapies?
Thank you. Let me focusing on the aspect of clinical practice and clinical trial. So we understand that COVID-19 situation affects clinical practice of AD, and it may affect the condition of participant with AD or MCI in clinical trial. So even in the situation in Japan, so we need to consider about that. As for clinical trials, PMDA released the Q&A document regarding conducting clinical trials of drug and other product under the influence of COVID-19. You can see the document about that. to conduct a clinical trial appropriately in Japan. So this is my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it is important. I mean, we heard yesterday at the beginning of the conference the impact on patients of COVID-19, very severe implications, but even in terms of the research and development, it has affected clinical trials for anything that is non-COVID-19. So I think this is something we do need to bear in mind and, in a sense, pick up the pace again as the pandemic settles. Andy, I wanted to specifically ask you in relation to what we're talking about here, the issue of real-world evidence. How is it factored from your perspective into the COVID-19 response, and how do we potentially get to a similar place for AD?
Thank you, John. I'm sorry I had to come off mute. I think I want to echo the comments that Klaus and Maria emphasized, and that is COVID-19 has really fostered unprecedented cooperation and collaboration. I've never seen this degree of interoperability between industries, between regulators, between governments. It's just been astounding. And the hope is that this will continue and carry over. It won't sort of go away once the crisis seemingly is resolved. I think one of the things that's coming about in terms of that collaboration and cooperation is the recognition that there have been certainly pockets of exceptional excellence. But I use the metaphor, if you will, of a railway system where we've had great depots of information, depots of knowledge, depots of data, but we didn't have the track that was of the same gauge to enable the ability to move across and share between those depots. What's coming out of COVID-19, I think, is a lot of track building, a lot of agreement on what the right gauge of the track should be, so that that ability to seamlessly share knowledge, insights, information, policy decisions, I think will become much more fluid. And I hope that would continue and that we could import that or export it, if you will, well beyond COVID and a pandemic to this pandemic, which is Alzheimer's, and others, which are affecting us as humanity, not as whether we're Americans or Japanese or Europeans, et cetera. So I think that's the one big issue, is that ability to fluidly, continuously collaborate. I think it's also emphasized the importance of real-world evidence and real-world data to begin to have real-time, in the real world, understanding and assessment of the evolution and natural history of the disease. One of the things that real-world evidence illuminated, for example, in this disease is the understanding of the post-viral syndrome, or long haulers syndrome, the fact that what we thought was a respiratory virus at the outset turned out to have far greater impact as an endothelial virus that's attacking the lining of blood vessels and organs like the brain, the kidney, the heart, et cetera. That it's disrupting the immunologic system in ways that are producing perhaps autoimmune disease as a subsequent consequence of the disease. So real-world evidence is playing a role in understanding the natural history of the disease. It's also helping us to understand the performance of products that are being approved through accelerated mechanisms like the emergency use authorizations. And that's been particularly helpful in sorting through diagnostics, for example. And it's going to be increasingly important as we begin to look at the availability of vaccines, and knowing that there will be multiple vaccines that will be approved, widely used and disseminated. And we'll need to have an infrastructure of real-world evidence to understand the performance of those vaccines in different populations, and to understand the performance of vaccines vis-a-vis one against the other, as so that policymakers and payers and providers will be able to make decisions with regard to appropriate utilization of those various vaccines. All that's coming from real-world evidence.
Thanks very much, Andy. I think in terms of everything that all of you have said, many things have happened in the last 9 to 10 months, and the term unprecedented keeps being repeated all the time. I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, people were saying it would take 12 to 18 months before a vaccine would appear. And already, even before the end of this year, we already begin to see approvals coming through with potential initial use in priority populations. And I think the important thing now for Alzheimer's is to make sure that these lessons really are codified. They become part and parcel of the way in which regulators work. And at the beginning, we were alluding to the degree of collaboration that had already built up pre-COVID. I think COVID has actually taken it forward. I mean, there have been great opportunities in spite of the tragic circumstances of the pandemic. And as we address the pandemic with AD, I think it behooves regulators and all the stakeholders in the system to really take these lessons to heart. But I would like to also touch on this issue because we talked about sharing of information, collaboration, real-world evidence, the need to track events post-approval, because even within trials, you wouldn't necessarily pick up all the adverse events. And there's been a lot of reliance and sharing of information going on. But perhaps a question to the audience's mind, especially in terms of what has happened in the last 24 hours, is as one regulator has made a very quick early approval under emergency use authorization for a vaccine, and then we're still waiting for the FDA and EMA positions, and of course other regulators. Can you say a bit more about the issues here? Because I think people may be a little confused. We've talked about how optimistic we are for regulators being able to communicate with each other, and yet we've seen the situation in the last 24 hours. I don't know whether Klaus perhaps would like to give a quick response, and then Maria, and then we'll try and wrap up in terms of final thoughts.
Well, has been a political decision based hopefully on sufficient evidence, and it is not as such. It is not an authorization, a marketing authorization as such. Jun Rain made this clear, but a kind of a batch release for use in special subgroups while the evaluation is ongoing. And maybe that is a model also for other disease areas, something we ought to consider while we are shifting as regulators our focus more on post-marketing activities, provided the population is willing to take certain risks and uncertainties, is willing to live with uncertainties, of which we have a lot in the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll learn as we move along and as we start vaccinating people. So if we, and Maria mentioned this earlier, as long as we stay transparent about it and communicate very clearly on what sort of basis a potential approval has been given or will be given, what the uncertainties and risks are, and what we continue to provide in terms of oversight, as long as we are clear about this and the population understands this in lay language, then we can shift the axis. We can shift the moment of an early approval forwards. Approve a license or approve earlier. Otherwise, it will have a very strong political overlay, which perhaps is not what we desire as independent regulators. And that's all I can say on this. But in terms of collaboration, indeed, we have the Access Consortium you mentioned, Australia, Canada, Singapore, Switzerland, the UK now as well, and perhaps very soon our Anvisa colleagues from Brazil joining a very special coalition of regulators where we hope we can exchange our views, our assessments more rapidly and also more openly. This should be helpful, but it does not replace or displace our exchange with reference agencies like the FDA and EMA. And one example I want to mention, I know we're running out of time, John, but oncology, again, could be in terms of international collaboration. That was your point, our role model, our beacon, if you like. If I look at the FDA, and Andy may remember him or you know him very well, Rick Padstuer, our oncology colleague, heading the office of, he has a trans office, a trans center sort of function now, spanning CBER and CEDAR, the only therapeutic area that has been able to do this. He founded Orbis, which is an international group of regulators undertaking a simultaneous review of oncology, typically early submitted oncology applications, and fostering a very lively exchange, enabling a shortening of the submission gap worldwide, so patients have access to potentially innovative oncology drugs even earlier. So again, oncology and also the ongoing pandemic are two beacons, role models that AD can learn from a lot. And then the financial incentive I mentioned a couple of times. We shouldn't forget about this, the economic burden, unfortunately, that may perhaps even accelerate these activities.
Very good, Klaus. We only have a few minutes left, so I'd like to pose to each of you, what is your one key takeaway from the regulatory perspective that we would like to see happen in the build-up to next year's Lausanne meeting, when we hope we can meet physically in person? And I will start with Maria, pose it to Ken next, Klaus, and I'll ask Andy to make the final comment. Maria, what would you be your key hope for the year ahead from a regulatory perspective?
To me, to be honest, is keeping the momentum, like you mentioned. The saying that we are sharing information, companies are commercially sharing information, keep it. We have a drug, FDA is going to lead. They've been very transparent in the way that they are evaluating the drug, which, like I say, is something to congratulate. Of course, we wish all the best to Billy and his team. And we will have a drug. And the reality is how we're going to improve the biomarkers, then probably we'll start in very small population, and how we're going to build and learn from that population. Then I take in also from Klaus that, one is the regulatory pathways there. Two, we wish the best to our colleagues in the FDA. Billy and team, they are very transparent. They have done a wonderful job. And if it will be a drug, like Klaus said, it will be a small population, and we need to build and learn from there. How we to expand what else we need. Because this is only one mechanism of action. And like the vaccines, no one only vaccine. We need a lot of vaccines. And like there will come one, but there will come 6 or 7 in the next 3 months. And Europe will have it in January. It's not so different. And Klaus will have vaccines also probably by January. And PMDA, I don't think. But the question is that how we build enough, or what we learn. Then thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Ken, one takeaway from you?
Thank you. I would like to introduce 4 faster policy in PMDA's effort. So it contains patient first, access first, safety first, and Asia first. This is important effort for PMDA, and this will important not only for AD drug development but also as a disease area. So please understand this and remember this, and look for detailed information in PMDA website. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Klaus, one takeaway?
Yeah, sorry. One word, a new word, if you like, would be unsilo. Let's not get stuck in silos. Also, when we convene these meetings and preparing one for next year, let's not operate in silos. This panel was a good example. We look across different therapeutic areas, different phases of drug development, pre and post marketing, and also have some deep expertise in Alzheimer's. So let's unsilo, if you like, and let's take something like Orbis or OCE. I now remember the acronym. Rick Padstuer, I mentioned earlier on, the Oncology Center of Excellence. That created a lot of momentum, but Rick had to convince policymakers and politicians in the first place. That may serve as an example to unsilo. So this would be my word for this session. Let's unsilo AD.
Very powerful word. We look forward to that next year as well as we move towards Lausanne. Andy, last word to you, please.
Yeah, I'd echo Klaus's unsiloing from the perspective that as regulators, we have to understand and appreciate that the solution to a problem like cancer or Alzheimer's is going to require the integrated interoperability of components. And our ability to see those individual components, be they small molecules or antibodies or even biomarkers, but recognize that it's their interoperability. It's our ability to put them together into a system that becomes a solution. And we have to regulate the system as well as the components. And that is a really major challenge that requires, as Klaus said, getting out of the silos, sharing knowledge and information, but seeing the solution in addition to just the components.
Thanks, Andy. I think we can be optimistic because, in fact, the trending is in the directions you've been describing. And so I think we can look forward to next year with hope. And as Maria said, we hope that there will be approvals and approval of new products that will really address the AD situation and the needs of patients. Let me very quickly thank my panelists for all your inputs, for Maria, for Ken, for Klaus, for Andy. Thank you so much for this very invigorating discussion. And we hope that the audience has understood better the regulatory issues and where we are in the trends that we face now. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you and pass the time back to George. Thank you very much.